So I'd just like to start by thanking you all for coming tonight and to thank Chloe and her team for organising this event. So tonight, what I would like to do is just to introduce you to this exhibition and hopefully whet your appetite a bit to go and look at it for yourselves. It's online, so easy to access. So I'm going to start by thinking about what chapbooks are and why they're important. So we have these definitions of chapbooks, a modern name applied by book collectors and others to specimens of the popular literature, which was formerly circulated by itinerant dealers or chapmen, consisting chiefly of small pamphlets of popular tales, ballads, tracts, etc. And a chapman is an itinerant dealer who travels about from place to place selling or buying, one who keeps booths at markets, etc., a hawker or a peddler. And I'm sure lots of you knew that before. In fact, there's actually quite a lot of debate about the term chapbook, and sometimes you'll also hear this kind of material called pamphlets, or as Scott called it, stall tracts. Essentially, this is the inexpensive popular literature that was printed up quickly and cheaply to share news, to communicate popular songs and also the stories of the day. And it was sold either by stalls or by people travelling the country and going from door to door, chapmen who chapped at your door. So you can see the connection. And you can learn more about the life of one of these chapmen in the exhibition and hear from him about his life. So if we could have our first sound clip, please.
I made myself a chapman when very young, in great hopes of being rich when I became old. But fortune was fickle, and so was I, for I had not been a chapman above 2 days until I began to consider the danger of deep ditches, midden dubs, biting dogs and bogles in barns, bangster wives and wheat sacks. And what comfort is it, says I, to lie in the cow's oxter the length of a cold winter night, to sit behind backs till the kale be all kerned up, and then to lick Collie's leavings?
Thank you, Nicole. So you can see this was not a very attractive idea. So if we could, yeah, thank you. This is not a very attractive life for John Cheap, our chapman. It's fairly miserable. And equally, the literature itself was not meant to last. As we can see in the exhibition, it was the fish and chip newspaper of its day. And in the novel The Heart of Midlothian, Scott gives a nod to this by describing one chapbook arriving at the door of his heroine, Jeanie Deans, as rapping for a muckle cheese that has come to the family as a gift from the milkmaid Dolly Dutton. So it was meant to be read, reused and thrown away. So why is this throwaway literature so interesting to us today? Well, there are actually many fascinating things about this material. It covers a vast range of subjects: politics, song, traditional ballads, recipes, advice about the dangers to watch out for when you go to visit London, fairy tales, popular poems, superstitions, and advice about how to predict the future, about what kind of spouse you're likely to have. As even this short selection indicates, chapbooks cover many areas, and they give us a real insight into what ordinary people at the time were reading and what interested them. Categories blend together too, so that much of the song material in the collection is impossible to separate from politics. So you have, for example, young women lamenting their sweethearts who've been press-ganged into the Navy to fight for the French, or on the other hand, young women encouraging their partners to behave in patriotic ways and to fight for their country. We also find out quite a lot from the chapbooks about bookselling and printing practices at the time. Scott's chapbooks show a network of printers and booksellers operating around the south of Scotland and the north of England, sometimes sharing the same stories and woodcut illustrations. So you can see these things being shared. Also, the chapbooks contain interesting information about how books were bought and read. such as the notification we have on some of them that if you're not satisfied with the book, you can bring it back. So here we have on this illustration, if you do not think this book worth laying out 1 penny, be pleased to read it gratis, keep it clean and return it to whoever when called for. So how did Scott himself come to amass such an impressive collection of chapbooks and other popular print materials? And how did we come to discover it? Hopefully, some of you have already been at Abbotsford. If you haven't, go soon. It's a rare treat. But if you have been there, you will have seen Scott's magnificent library, and you've realised that Scott collected not only books, but all sorts of material and artefacts. Here, these pictures give you some idea of that. So we have Scott's armoury, where you have such treasures as Rob Roy's sword. We also have the entrance hall, where you can see suits of armour and panelling taken from various places, the fireplace modelled from Melrose, and all sorts of other treasures there at Abbotsford that Kirsty could tell you a lot more about. But as the library shows, collecting books was one of his biggest passions. Collecting print material at this time and the material derived from popular culture was not unusual. And in the 18th century, we have collectors such as Bishop Percy, who had published material from the English vernacular tradition in reliques of ancient English poetry, and others such as Joseph Ritson, Alan Ramsay, Burns, and indeed Scott himself were to follow in this tradition of gathering ballads from the oral tradition and printing them into books. What is remarkable, though, is to find Scott collecting this material in cheap chapbook format, even as a boy of 10 years old. Indeed, Scott writes, "The first time, too, I could scrape a few shillings together, which were not uncommon occurrences with me. I bought myself a copy of these beloved volumes." From comments like these, we knew that Scott owned some chapbooks, and in his 1962 article, Scott's Boyhood collection of chapbooks, a former librarian at Abbotsford, James C. Corson, informs us that Scott had a collection of 114 chapbook items collected by him as a boy. Indeed, Scott himself notes this inside one of his volumes. So if we could have the second sound file, please.
This little collection of stalled tracts and ballads was formed by me when a boy from the baskets of the travelling pedlars. It contains most of the pieces that were popular about 30 years since, and I dare say many that could not now be procured for any price.
However, we did suspect that Scott owned far more chapbooks than this, because in his account of his library, Reliquiae Trotcosiensis, he notes that he'd purchased many volumes of such material from the book collector, John Bell. In fact, he says he had purchased the stock of John Bell in its entirety. When Mr. Bell retired from business, he writes, "I became purchaser of his stock of trade, which of course added no less than 40 or 50 volumes to the contents of the Lock Press already mentioned." Now, Gerard Carruthers and I came across this reference when we were tasked with editing Reliquiae Trotcosiensis, and as you can imagine, we were intrigued. So on one winter day, over 20 years ago now, when we were working in the library with the late Douglas Gifford, who was then Honorary Librarian at Abbotsford, we decided, on a bit of a hunch, to open one of the more tricky Abbotsford bookcases before calling it a day. Now imagine it gets very dark and cold in Abbotsford in January, and the locks in the bookcases are, and I'm sure Kirsty will attest to this, and some others who I can see in tonight too, that these are very challenging. And when we opened that bookcase, what we discovered was not 114 chapbooks, but hundreds of chapbooks. Later, we went round the entire library, not later that day, I hasten to add, we came back another weekend, and we went round the entire library, and on a rough estimate, we reckoned there were about 3,000 chapbooks, tracts and pamphlets. Can you imagine how exciting that was? So what happened next? Well, for various historical reasons, the books in Scott's Library are in the care of the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust. And between 2003 and 2013, the library was catalogued by Dr. Lindsay Levy. There are, in fact, over 9,000 books in the library, and her catalogue showed that some of them are extremely rare. However, while the bound volumes containing the chapbooks were catalogued at this stage, for sake of time, the individual items were not. However, finally, with the aid of Angela Schofield and Rosemary Patterson of the Advocates Library, the chapbooks are all finally catalogued and now form part of the electronic and publicly available catalogue of the Abbotsford Library. So you can go and look for yourselves to see what Scott has. The information this provided us with was astonishing. A rough guess of around 3,000 items was not far wrong. And while many of Scott's chapbooks are held in other collections too, some of Scott's chapbooks are very rare. And as I said earlier, they provide us with a unique snapshot of what ordinary people were reading in Scott's time and in the preceding century. So what to do next? Of course, what everyone immediately wants is for a collection like this to be digitised. And ultimately, that may be what we want to do too. But we couldn't afford that. And to be honest, we weren't going to get any funding for that until we undertook further investigation into the significance and importance of this collection. Now, while for people like Kirsty, Jerry and Ainsley and myself, these chapbooks are important because they're Scott's chapbooks, we also recognised that we didn't have the expertise to do work on this material on our own. As I've already stated, the material in these chapbooks is diverse. And in order to really understand it, you need the expertise of those who work on political history, song, folk tradition, ballads, not to mention bibliographers and book historians. So what we did was we applied, Jerry Cuthers and myself, on behalf of the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust, and in partnership with Abbotsford Trust, applied for and were lucky enough to receive a Royal Society of Edinburgh networking grant to bring these scholars together to undertake preliminary work on this magnificent collection. And it's thanks to the RSC that we've gained an initial understanding of its significance and have been able to mount, after some delays caused by COVID, I'd have to say, this exhibition. So this is a photo of some of the network people who we went for a walk to see Melrose by moonlight, or rather now as it is, Melrose Abbey floodlit, following one of our network events. Scott, as some of you know, advises in The Lay of the Last Minstrel that the best way to see Melrose Abbey is by moonlight. So off we went after a hard day's thinking about chapbooks. So what's in the exhibition? As I'm sure you'll appreciate, the biggest challenge has been to select from the collection aspects of it to highlight here. It's so exciting and so diverse that choosing what to include has been a real challenge. So what we've tried to do is to select areas that seem representative of it, but I must also confess that we've probably chosen sections that reflect our interests. So after learning about chapbooks, chapmen and how Scott acquired this collection, you'll find the following sections. So we have a section on superstition and folk belief. Now, had we not been hexed by COVID, we would have launched this exhibition at Halloween, because this is a particularly rich area of the collection. Chapbooks tell the stories of lovers haunted by dead sailors, the whole invisible world, and how we might understand it. And indeed, the ways in which a lingering belief in the supernatural can be used to manipulate wayward husbands and wandering lovers. One of the things I like about these stories is the ways in which ordinary people often get the better of lawyers and clergymen, and women frequently are given more power than you might expect. Closely related to this kind of material is a section that we've called Warnings and Advice. Scott's chapbooks provide us with information on how to get spots out of linen, something we all need to know, but they also contain fascinating material on how to find out the kind of man or woman you're going to marry, how to tell what is in store for you more generally, and how to conduct your financial affairs, if only Scott had listened. Now, I'm not going to give too much away in the way of advice, so you're going to have to look at the exhibition yourselves to find out more. But here's a taster of what you might expect. So if we could have our last sound file, please.
A seventh way is this. The last time you hear the cuckoo sing, look under your left shoe, and you shall find a hair the colour of your wives or husbands without the help of the devil.
Now, please note, though, that while we have provided you with some of this information, and we've even given you instructions on how to make your own fortune teller, we're not endorsing of any of these methods, so we're not going to be held liable. So if you could have the slides, please. Thank you. So the next area we've chosen to look at is fairy tales and children's literature. So this is another of our favourite sections. While collectors like the Grimms were gathering together fairy tale material at this time into official collections, it was also circulating in the chapbooks of the day. So Scott's collection contains versions of Sleeping Beauty, Jack and the Giant Slayers, Tom Thumb, and other popular stories of this sort. And often these versions are more complicated and less morally directed than the versions that came to dominate in later years. They're also certainly far less sanitised than the Disney versions that some of us grew up with. So while the collection also contains didactic material for children, such as the catechism featured here, it's clear that the whole category of children's literature in this period is something more complex, and there are people doing work on this, and we hope the collection can contribute to that. As one might expect from the turbulent nature of the 17th, 18th and early 19th centuries, politics is also an area that predominates in many of the pamphlets and chapbooks at Abbotsford. One of Scott's recurring topics in his fictional work, of course, is Jacobitism, and he has an impressive collection of Jacobite material, including many pamphlets on this topic. Closer to his own times, chapbooks celebrate the victories at Waterloo, the defeat of Napoleon, and also reflect the fraught nature of politics in Britain itself at the time. Again, while some of this follows a more official, sort of celebratory tone, other chapbooks interestingly reflect how war is experienced by the ordinary people caught up in it. And this is also reflected in much of the song material in the collection. Another category we've highlighted, some of you may know we've also got a parallel exhibition going on Scott and song, but we've highlighted the song material in the chapbooks. The chapbooks themselves contain song material of a diverse nature, and Scott also has an impressive collection of slip songs, songs printed on long slips of paper like the ones you see on either side of the slide. And I've included Andrew Lamy here because any of you from the Northeast, you'll recognise that as one of our local ballads. There is, I think, lots of work to be done in this area of the collection, as the movement of songs around the country and the ways in which they're adapted to reflect current concerns hopefully is something that can be more fully understood by those who have the expertise via a collection like this. Earlier, however, I said that what most interested me about this collection was that it was Scott's collection of chapbooks. There are other impressive chapbooks collections in libraries across the world, but this one belongs to the author Walter Scott, and it's preserved in his home at Abbotsford, alongside all the other riches in his library. And that in itself tells us something about how highly Scott thought of this popular material. But we've also included a section drawing more overt connections between the chapbook material he owned and his creative work. For Scott, the materials you gather from the past always offered the opportunity to tell a story, and there's clear evidence that he read this popular print material, that he actively engaged with it, and that he used it to provide inspiration, detail and colour for his own poems and novels. So collecting this material was never simply an antiquarian pursuit for Scott, but something he saw as relating to a living, vibrant culture that was connected to the stories he was writing himself. It may surprise some people to find that Scott is so engaged with this popular material, and this has the potential, we hope, to change how we think of him and indeed his home at Abbotsford. I hope you take the chance to look at this exhibition. It is, however, important to add that the exhibition, and indeed the work we've done so far, only scratches the surface of the opportunities this collection presents. There are actually years of work to be undertaken on Scott's chapbook and popular print material to fully understand it. And all we've aimed to do with this project is to highlight its richness and invite other scholars more specialised in relevant fields to dig deeper for the treasures it has yet to yield. In a moment, I'm going to put some questions to Kirsty Archer-Thompson, Collections and Interpretations Manager at Abbotsford, and Ainsley, who's been the Research Assistant for the project. And then we'll open this up to your questions. First, though, there's a few people I would really like to thank. First of all, Lindsay McReady from the University of Aberdeen web team, who has put together the exhibition and made it look so impressive. Thank you for this and for your endless patience with us as we kept changing our minds. Thanks too to Chloe and her colleagues for organising this event. The Abbotsford Trust, and particularly Kirsty Archer-Thompson, have as ever been generous in their support, and the Faculty of Advocates Abbotsford Trust both facilitated the cataloguing of the chapbooks and have allowed images from them to be used. I'd like to thank Ainsley for her work on this project and my other research assistants, Anna and Natalie, for their enthusiasm in stepping in to support me in the closing stages of setting it up. Unfortunately, Jerry Carruthers, co-leading this project, cannot join us to speak tonight, but thank you, Jerry, for everything you've done. I'd like to thank the RSE for providing the funds to make this exhibition and the larger network possible, and all the members of the network for bringing the expertise that no one individual could possibly have to our understanding of this collection. Your work is represented here too. And I'd like to thank the late Douglas Gifford, my predecessor as Honorary Librarian at Abbotsford, for his passion for Scott's Library and the energy with which he helped facilitate work on it. So I'm just going to hand over to Kirsty, and Kirsty and Ainsley and myself are going to have a chat about some of the things that we would also like to bring to your attention, and then we'll open it up to your questions. Kirsty.
Thank you so much, Ali. Thank you. I mean, thank you for that romp through the best part of, I suppose, 25 years of a story in the making. Without wishing to make you feel old, I'm always fascinated by that excitement, that palpable sense of excitement in the 1990s and early 2000s as you were starting to discover this untapped collection, and you were exploding the statistics that Corson proposed of, maybe a couple of hundred of these items. You realized that the expanse of the collection was vast compared with previous estimations. But I was wondering if you sort of rewind, if you can, back to the 1990s and your first look at some of this material. Were you aware at that point that this aspect of Scott's collection had such untapped potential for understanding his literature, or was that something that came a little bit later on?
That's a really good question, Kirsty. I think we knew it was exciting, and I mean what we did, we're thinking a very different Abbotsford. It was still a home that was lived in at that point. We had the privilege, when Douglas was Honorary Librarian, to be able to go in the winter when it was shut to the public and at weekends, and we did a stock check. Douglas, one of the things he wanted to do was a stock check in the library, and then we checked to see if everything was actually where it was in the 19th century catalogue, if it was still on the shelves where Scott had left it. So we took all the books off the shelf and looked at them. And when we came across this collection, which I had a real hunch where it was in the library, I thought, I bet it's in that cupboard. And indeed it was. It was so exciting just to find all these chapbooks. And just looking through them initially, you could see all the many subjects they were covering. And, at that point, we were still finishing the Edinburgh edition of the Waverley novels. And, your mind's also racing, thinking, oh, we're going to find lots of things we should have known about, But it was clear it was important. I don't think with any collection, you can't actually know how important it is until you do the hard work. And, thanks to the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust, the cataloguing of the library and of the chapbooks, it's only then that you can really gauge how important it is as a collection. And of course, you start to actually read some of this material and you can see how it's intersecting with all the other things we know about Scott, and your mind is expanding. But I've only read a fraction of these chapbooks so far, so as I say, I think there's a life's work here to fully understand all the ways it connects to Scott.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that really interests me is we've talked a lot in the exhibition about the eclecticism of chapbooks, and that's part of their joy, the idea of the garland being a bringing together of all kinds of different items in one work. One of the things that I often think about Scott is he deliberately seeks out, or seems to seek out, things that offer him varying views, oppositional views on whether it's particular debates, the supernatural, political events. I think it was perhaps the legal mind in him, the advocate, the sheriff deputy, that was sort of interested in how arguments could be shaped from various sides, and finding a way to negotiate that. Do you think that the polarization of views in some of the chapbook items would have particularly interested him? Would that have fed some of his characterizations and detail in his literature?
Yes, I mean, absolutely. I think, for Scott, a good story can be found anywhere. But equally, as I often say, Scott doesn't tell you what to think, Scott makes you think. And there's a big difference between those two things. And Scott makes you think because he often is allowing multiple voices to be at play, different perspectives, different emotional resonances to inhabit the same space. And I think, the chapbooks, because they have that very eclectic way of looking at things from different perspectives, looking at things from outside the official line, I think that absolutely would have appealed to him. So often in his novels and his poems too, to some extent, it's those voices at the margin that actually say the most interesting things, or who sometimes hold the bit of information that is crucial to how we understand what's happening. And I think those voices very much come from the chapbooks, those alternative voices. I think the fact, that the muckle cheese that arrives in the heart of Midlothian actually contains the information that Jeannie has been searching for, for the whole novel, really. What's happened to her sister's child? Did she kill it, or did she not?
Cheese is always the answer. There you go.
And cheese is always the answer. So, I think it's such a Scott thing to do, that actually this bit of information that everybody's been searching for actually arrives in the form of a chapbook, a broadside wrapped around a bit of cheese.
There's probably not a neat segue away from cheese to something else.
No, it probably isn't.
Thinking about, Ainsley, your particular research interests, which, given your editorial work on Marmion, I think that the political aspects of that poem and the framing of it come to the fore. Is there anything that you've noticed in these very initial explorations of the chapbook collection at Abbotsford, either relating to Marmion specifically in the political context there, or broader issues pertaining to Scott's poetry?
Sure. So, excuse me. So yes, Scott writes the bulk of Marmion. To give you a bit of context about the poem, he kind of writes the bulk of that poem in the year 1807, and it's published in February 1808. So he's writing that poem after the kind of peak of the huge invasion crisis of the years 1803 to 1805. So you're past that moment of extreme anxiety during the wars, but you're still very much in that moment, and that those kind of feelings, that anxiety, is not going to abate until Napoleon's final defeat at Waterloo in 1815. So it's deep anxiety, that kind of fraught tension, and those kind of the events of the war, they're written deep into Marmion. But absolutely unsurprisingly, they feature significantly in the chapbook collections as well. And there are literally hundreds and hundreds of items that relate to the war in one way or another. I think I did a kind of rough estimate. This was like in 2020 when I first managed to see the chapbooks in person, because obviously COVID had scuppered our ability to get to actually look at the chapbooks. And I think I counted something like 500 items that related to just military land warfare. So I was kind of treating naval engagements separately, but just a huge collection of items that relate to aspects of the wars. But I think, what is most interesting is it's the range of the types of items, the sort of topics, but it's more the range of voices Ali's kind of referred to that already. So you have your usual voices. You have the things that you expect to hear, and so government directives, the voices of kind of field marshal, and you're going to get like the leaders, but you also have those voices of ordinary people, so the foot soldiers, eyewitness testimonies to battles, civilians who are caught up in these events. So it's a very, very, very different kind of history than the one that we kind of are used to reading. And what I like as well is that it's kind of the significant presence of women's voices in the material as well. So Ali's kind of referenced that. Yeah, you've got your usual kind of, I guess, the things you would most typically imagine to find. So you've got a huge number of songs, for example, that reference the war, and female laments for lovers and fathers going off to fight in the war. But what I really enjoyed was finding items that suggest women are kind of proactively also engaged in the war. So one of my favourite kind of items is kind of titled "The Wonderful Woman" or "The Female Sailor," and it celebrates the exploits of a woman who apparently goes to fight for the glory of England, and engages in sort of 10 naval engagements, losing 3 fingers but gaining £500 of prize money in the process. It's just these kind of really wonderfully evocative kind of stories that you don't normally get from just reading history books. And so I think that in other ways the politics of the time play out in various other ways. I think what you come away with is just a sense of the things that concern any generation and concern people in any time, those things don't change. People don't change. So the things that concern us today were the things that concerned people then, 200 years ago. And I think it's almost impossible to be talking about this aspect of the collection without it coming into our mind the events that are happening this week in Ukraine. These terrible, this cycle of events of the kind of it started again. So I think it's a diversity and the range and all these kind of untapped stories that are in there that really, really appeal to me, and I think to all of us, actually, to all 3 of us, and to Jerry as well. I mean, I suppose maybe Kirsty, maybe I could ask you a question, because with your Abbotsford hat on, you get hundreds of visitors every year, and they must come to the house with all their preconceptions about Scott, about who he is, what he stands for. How do you think this collection might change that? What kind of aspects of the collection have appealed to you in that sense?
A great question. I mean, I think you're right that there are preconceptions. There is sort of cultural baggage that people sometimes bring when they think we're visiting the home of Sir Walter Scott, and they put a lot of emphasis on the Sir. I don't think actually that baronetcy of 1820 does Scott a lot of favours in appearing accessible and relatable to many different portions of our 21st century society. And I think because he crafts a house that appears to be it mimics a hereditary seat going back hundreds of years, and he does that all quite deliberately. It's all a piece of theatre, but it has that initial veneer of landed aristocracy, which of course Scott is not. So there there's a little bit of a pivot that we need to go through, and one of the things we focused on at Abbotsford over the more recent past is in making Scott accessible, is in actually informing visitors that Scott makes his own fortune. He finds his own way, not on the backs of the less fortunate, not through stakes in the slave trade and all the other things that were going on within the context of his time that are perhaps less savoury, but actually through sheer talent and his literary labours. So there's a kind of not re-education in a forceful way, but there's a chance for us to kind of show Scott the man, and that's something we try and do at Abbotsford. I think the chapbooks are a super rich vein of emphasis on, as you said there, the plurality of voices in the past. That so often, because of the way that history is written, we only hear the exploits of monarchs or great military strategists, politicians, great artists and writers. We rarely hear of the ordinary folk. They sort of fall through the cracks. And the nice thing about the chapbooks is, of course, it brings them to life. It shows what their concerns were, what their daily labours and focuses, and indeed the news they were consuming was like. And actually the collection at Abbotsford, even though our star items are very much the items associated with the big names from history, they're what people come to see, we have many, many items that show that plurality of voices, but in object form. And I love that synergy between the chapbook collection and the objects overall. that, you know, we've got cooking utensils, we've got morsels of food, we've got little pocketbooks of unknown soldiers. You know, we've got many, many items that are actually rustic, ordinary mementos of lives lost, and actually the object that they've left behind might be the only record that these people were ever there at all. That's how history works. And I think Scott was interested, as Ali said, in all of it, all of history, not just sort of cherry picking, you know, particular to figures and sidelining the rest. Certainly the novels always show those ordinary common people in a really vibrant and dynamic way. They tend to be the most memorable characters, don't they?
Yeah, most definitely. Thanks for that.
So do we want to move to maybe some questions, Chloe, from our audience?
Yep, I'm just trying to pop my video back on. Oh, there we go. It is letting me do that. Perfect. Yeah, so we actually have some questions already, which is fantastic. So Elizabeth has said to Ali, did you have one favourite discovery in the collection that stopped you in your tracks that you could share?
Oh, I'm really guilty of the thing that I'm working on at the moment. It's always the thing I'm most excited about. You know, it's the same when people ask me what my favourite Scott novel or poem is. Like the one I'm working on just now. So it's really hard to pick out one thing. I mean, there were things that stopped me in my tracks because they made me a bit worried. We came across a chapbook that had Lochinvar in it, which of course features in Marmion. It's Lady Heron's song in Marmion. And, you know, I kind of scrambled to find the date of the chapbook to discuss, you know, to my relief that it was published after Marmion, which is really interesting. So, you know, it'd been extracted from Marmion and put into a chapbook, whereas you had that moment of fear that it was actually a traditional ballad that, you know, we didn't know anything about, but thankfully not. One of my favourite chapbooks, and we have included it in the exhibition, and it's been there, for me, it's been there since our work, that we came across quite early on, is one about Nell and the lawyer outwitted. And I just absolutely love this chapbook for all sorts of reasons. And we tell the story of it in the exhibition, so I'm not going to say too much about it. But what I really like about it is that it's an ordinary woman, and you know, it deals with domestic issues. She manages to outwit her elderly lawyer husband by all sorts of means. And given that Scott was a lawyer and that the collection is owned by the Faculty of Advocates, Abbotsford Collection Trust, this particularly appealed to me. So I always come back to Nell and the lawyer outwitted as one of my favourites. But I absolutely love all the ones that tell the future, that, you know, give us advice on how to find good husbands. I really like that bit of the collection as well. So yeah, I mean, it's really hard to pick one thing, I'd have to say. But
I think we were all a bit worried about the favourites question, because we were thinking, how would we choose? There's so many.
Yeah. Kirsty, did you have a favourite? Or yeah.
I have a favourite area rather than a favourite item at the minute. I mean, my favourite area is hands down the fairy tales and folk tales sort of thematic segment, because I'm really interested in Scott's absolute love affair with late medieval romance, and that bleeds very nicely into the fairy tale and folk tale tradition. So there are some common motifs there, and I think they pop up so frequently in his writing. So that's an area particularly that I'm really keen to do some further work on. But, you know, I think the great thing about the chapbooks is they're earthy. They make you smile. You know, these are items, we were talking about it just the other day, some of the sort of Netflix documentaries of today that we're all consuming on an evening about, you know, people getting duped and, you know, all sorts of conspiracies and things, that they would be the fodder of the chapbooks in times past. So, but they're wonderful things.
I was going to wait and see if Ainsley, if you've got anything to add to that, if you've got any kind of favourites or stop you in your tracks kind of moments.
Sure. I mean, we were incredibly excited when we got to spend that day or 2 days looking through these items down in Abbotsford. And I feel like if you ask me this question tomorrow, I'd have a different answer probably, because every day it's something else. But I mean, what really excited me was there was a whole volume, a bound volume of items that related to the Burke and Hare murders that kind of would have shocked Edinburgh in the late 1820s. You know, and well, I mean, it's fantastic material. We kind of all decided it probably merits its own exhibition. There's just too much in there to try and squash into the current exhibition. But I would love to go back and to look at that material again. It gave you that kind of shock factor, and you could just imagine, you know, people just desperate to get the updates from the court and what was happening with these trials and so on. So yeah, I mean, that was a real highlight for me. But yeah, honestly, there's just a whole series of highlights in this collection. So yes, it is hard to just pick one, to be honest. But yeah.
And I think the next question kind of leads nicely. I know you kind of touched on this, but will Scott's chapbook collection eventually be like fully digitized? And will people then get to find their own stop you in your tracks moments?
Oh, well, that's what we would love. I mean, to be honest, for all sorts of reasons, we would like as many people as possible to enjoy these, and also, you know, for as many scholars as possible to be able to work on them. Also, for practical reasons, these were cheap paper, cheap print, not meant to last. So obviously, to preserve them, we would like to have them digitized. But that is, you know, big expense, and we don't have the funds for that at the moment. So very much what we hope to do with this project, with the exhibition and with a collection of essays that we're planning, is to raise the profile and the significance of these chapbooks, and so therefore to you know, hope that we will be able to state how significant they are once we've had lots of people engage with them, with the hope of getting funding to digitise them. So that's what we would like. Yes.
Great. The next one is, do you know how many of Scott's chapbooks are related to the Jacobites?
I think this gets, Kirsty, do you want to come in on that? Or, sorry, no, are you happy for me to?
Yeah, please do.
I think I'm just putting in my, it's quite hard because, you know, this is where we get into really interesting questions of definition, in that, you know, there are chapbooks and then there are tracts and there are political pamphlets, and there are actually even scrapbooks with items pasted in relating to politics. So the proportion that relates to Jacobites, I wouldn't want to say, but there is very definitely a collection which Scott recognized. You know, there's one bit of the collection where Scott says, these are my Jacobite items, and he's sort of identifying them as a discrete bit of the collection. So you can see how interested he is in that bit of the collection. And I mean, what you'll see in the exhibition is, certainly seems to be that he is drawn on some of this material for some of his Jacobite writings. So, you know, you would expect there to be quite a lot of Jacobite material. But as I say, you know, you can look at the catalogue. The catalogue's publicly available. So you can, you know, people who are interested, and you can isolate various things in the chapbook, in the catalogue generally. So play about with it and get a sense of that for yourselves. But I mean, that's certainly an area where I think there's a lot of work to be done on that bit of the collection. I mean, there's some fantastic things in there. It's, you know, so I think one of Kirsty's favourites, isn't there, Kirsty, in there? Yeah. So.
Great. And
Shall I? Oh, sorry, Clary. Go on.
No, on you go. On you go.
I was just thinking about looking at Amber's question about the binding of the chapbooks. Shall I take that one? Shall we? Yeah. We cover this in the exhibition to some extent. In that Ali mentioned in the introductory talk the collection from John Bell, who was a Newcastle bookseller, and the 50 volumes or so that come from his collection. They were already bound, and they've still got John Bell's bookplate on. So Scott doesn't interfere where the material, the chapbook material he's acquiring, is already bound in volumes. but there's also examples of him binding or giving instruction basically to bind collections of chapbooks with his personal book stamp on the spine, which is the portcullis symbol and clausus tutus ero, his little motto. That's also incidentally a version of the portcullis gates at Abbotsford, so he makes that his kind of personal book stamp. So there's a little bit of both going on there.
Great, thank you. Our next question is, have you found any marginalia, apologies if I pronounced that incorrectly, in Scott's hand in many of the chapbooks?
Yes, we have. We haven't found a great deal yet, but we haven't been through every single chapbook yet, I have to say. You know, we've only looked at a selection of them, but we have come across. So there's one in the exhibition where Scott has made a note on it, identifying what's going on. And there are undoubtedly others where he's done that. There's certainly ones where he's kind of done his own index of what's in the volume. I think probably when he's quite young, actually. And so there are notes by Scott, and I imagine we'll find more. We've got some bookmarks in, which of course is very tantalising to think Scott's bookmark, but it would be quite hard to tell whether it is Scott's bookmark. But there are places where we can see evidence of Scott having been there. So yes, yeah, there is certainly there is some marginalia in the chapbooks. And then there's marginalia in other hands as well, you know, so he's obviously bought, you know, the nature of this material is he's bought material that other people have annotated before he's had it, because of course these are all second or third or fourth hand items. So there are obviously earlier annotations in there too, and they're interesting as well.
And Scott is particularly hands-on with his broader book collection. There is a great deal, as Ali will attest, and Ainsley too, a great deal of marginalia in the Abbotsford Library as a whole. It's a wonderful record of how Scott is engaging with his research material in many cases for using for his literature. So yeah, I mean, actually in most cases on the library catalogue, and we'll see if we can share a link to that too, so that you can explore the catalogue is hosted by the Faculty of Advocates. Usually where there's marginalia in a volume and we've recorded it, there's a digital image, so you can actually have a look at Scott's writing on the page.
Great, thank you. The next one is, are these chapbooks, and you kind of touched on this a bit earlier, but are these chapbooks generally of inferior paper, turning brown, and is the print font size proportionally smaller?
That's a really good question. Yes, the paper is inferior paper, and it is you know, it is turning brown. It is wearing at the edges. In some places, it's even, you know, the paper is so thin that there are words sort of beginning to disappear, either because the paper is worn into a hole or because the print has just rubbed off. So that's you know, that is one of the reasons why we have to be really careful about handling this material and use it, and why ultimately it'd be great to have it you know, digitized, so that would be really good. The font size actually varies hugely. That's a really interesting question. I hadn't really thought about that before. So it varies from quite small, particularly in those slip songs, it can be quite small. But actually in some of the chapbooks, it's quite big, actually, you know, and it strikes you as not being very many words on a page, if you see what I mean. So it kind of, that varies quite a lot. Yeah.
I think on the particularly the frontispieces, so where you get the woodcuts and things for the chapbook items, if you remember that they have a history as unbound items and were later bound, it gives you a sense actually, you know, these things are quite often pocket sized. They would have been popped in your pocket, taken out, so there'd be a lot of abrasion going on and things. So actually the darker colouring of that front page is simply because it would have been open to the elements, certainly in the earlier part of its life as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Obviously, we've posted a couple of links in the chat, but is it possible to see the collection in person at Abbotsford?
it's possible to see the collection in the bookcases at Abbotsford. So if you go to Abbotsford and you're going around the library, you know, you'll see where they are in the library. In terms of scholarship, we have an arrangement with the Faculty of Advocates. If scholars have an interest in any aspect of Scots Library, they can apply, and the link that I've put in for the catalogue also has the links to the protocols for how you can access things in Scots Library. And you know, any scholar who wants to see these things can apply, and if that's agreed, then they're items. It's been very difficult during COVID, but items taken up to the National Library for scholars to consult.
It's also,
we don't really have
sorry,
a facility at Abbotsford. We don't have a facility at Abbotsford for people to look at things. So yeah.
Yeah, I mean, being a historic house and also the kind of hub of a charity trust, because Abbotsford is independently run, we are shorter on space than you might imagine. We don't have a dedicated reading room and consultation space yet, is the phrase I would use. It is an aspiration in the future. But beyond that, thinking about access and having sight of inside the books in Scots Library, at any one time we have between 20 and 25 volumes from the library, and they may include chapbook volumes, absolutely, now that they're back home at Abbotsford following this project. They might well appear in our visitor centre exhibition space. So there's a rolling programme of display items there. They try and give you a sense of the diversity and the range of Scott's reading and research interests through his life.
Great. And are any of the chapbooks in Gaelic, and are any of the woodcuts coloured?
If I recollect, and I really am doing this from memory, I think there are some in Gaelic. Ainsley, do you recollect seeing some in Gaelic? I think we did when we were looking at them that day, that particular day when we were looking at some of them. I think we did encounter some in Gaelic. So I don't think there are many, but I think there are some. And some of the woodcuts coloured, yes, but not very many. It's what I say, occasional woodcut coloured. The difference is the colourful bit of the chapbook collections is actually something quite interesting, which is obviously later chapbooks derived from chapbooks derived from Scott's own novels and poems. You know, so this actually happened in Scott's lifetime, that you could pay, kind of a lot of money to buy an official Scott novel, but then chapbooks appeared for about a sixpence shortly afterwards, and they have wonderful coloured illustrations. They're brilliant. So they're one coloured element of the material, but there are not many of the woodcuts actually coloured. I think we saw some we've got one in the exhibition that's for my children's book, I think, if I remember, and there are some from more children's instructional books rather than children like fairy tale material or anything like that. But there's some brilliant images, I'd have to say. Really, really interesting images. Yeah.
And we just had another question following on. Have you compared the collection to other chapbook collections to evaluate for any duplicates?
Yes, when the collection was catalogued, Rosemary and Angela, who were involved with that, checked to see how many rare items there were and how many unique items there were. It's actually harder with chapbooks than it is with other material to some extent, because something can have the same title and it looks like it's the same thing, and actually it's not always quite the same thing. So it would be harder than sort of official print culture, if you like. But this is certainly there are quite a lot of duplicates. I'm not going to pretend there are not, and so they do appear. We haven't done that beyond that cataloguing exercise. We haven't got to the next stage, which I suppose is to go and see whether the chapbook we have called something is the same as the chapbook which, say, is in the Lawson collection in the National or something, whether it is actually the same, because there can be differences sometimes.
Just something that to add to Ali's answer there, particularly in relation to comparing the collection with others. One of the things I've got a real bee in my bonnet about, but I do realise it's going to take us some years to get any sense of the answer, is how Scott's chapbook collection compares to the chapbook collecting interests of other literary figures. We know that Robert Louis Stevenson was a great fan of chapbooks and collecting them. People like Samuel Johnson, Samuel Pepys. So there's you know, Scott isn't standing alone in this. There's a real sort of literary interest in chapbooks. And I'd love to see if there's any synergy there between some of these different figures. It very much depends, of course, in whether their personal libraries have in any sense remained, if there's any sort of frailer provenance to follow there. But I think it's a really interesting area for further research.
Yeah, and I see Melissa saying it'd be possible to do comparisons with the digitised collections, such as the NLS and some of those in Glasgow and in the United States as well. And certainly that is something that I think at some point would be a really good piece of work for somebody to do. You know, I think that would be a really interesting piece of work. But you know, what we're very much wanting to do is raise awareness of this collection, share something about its richness, and then, you know, hopefully scholars of all sorts of different sorts can then engage with it. Certainly, you know, I have no intention to do all the work that can be done on Scott's chapbooks myself, because I've got other things to do, like edit Scott's poetry. So, yeah, so I mean, we want people to engage with this collection.
And on that kind of engagement theme, Elizabeth's saying, like, although they are a treasure and extremely delicate, would the exhibition ever travel to Canada, example, for the Scottish diaspora to see?
Shall I answer that from a sort of collections management point of view?
Yeah.
I think the important thing for everybody here to know and to be confident in is that Abbotsford is, yes, of course, the great thing about it is we've got Scott's collection in its original context of his home, but we are aspiring in the next few years to become an accredited museum. We do lend the collection outwards. We've got several loan programs on the go at the moment. We haven't had the opportunity in quite a few years to lend internationally. That's simply that we haven't had the requests come in from international museums, libraries, and other heritage sites. But we'd be absolutely thrilled to get some of Scott's material to international audiences. So we are, you know, that would be subject to, you know, requests through to us and, you know, a partnership going ahead. So if there are venues out there that are particularly interested in any of the Abbotsford material, our door is always open for a conversation. I think it'd be wonderful, really wonderful.
Yeah, and I would, you know, one of the things is this exhibition is online, so anybody can look at it. And although it's a tiny bit of Scott's chapbook collection, you know, I mean, obviously our original intention was to have the exhibition at Abbotsford, and that's what we planned originally. But COVID, you know, has made us do all sorts of different things. And, you know, although it seems disappointing to have to do the exhibition online initially, actually the advantage of it is far more people can at least get to see the small proportion of things we've put into the exhibition now. And, you know, so in that sense, hopefully raising awareness a bit more maybe than if it had been a physical exhibition at Abbotsford.
Yeah, and hopefully, like you said, events like this, raising awareness, potentially will lead to, you know, requests coming in and the collection kind of being shared overseas. That would be a really kind of cool thing to see. We've got another question that says, relating to the rarity of the chapbooks, is there any information about the size of the print runs and their sales figures?
I don't know the answer to that. I suspect there are probably people here who do know more, and see some of the people from our network here who might know more about that. I actually don't know the answer to that. I think it would be hugely variable across the collection. I think some of these chapbooks we can gauge from the fact that quite a number of them are survived, so they are in other collections. That would imply there must have been quite a lot of them in the first place, if you see what I mean. Whereas with the ones that are more rare, possibly that's because they were smaller print runs. So that's one of the things you can gauge that by. But what is also, I think, you know, this would be true of all 19th century and 18th century printed material, but probably even more true of chapbooks, is sales figures in no way equates to reading numbers, you know, in that these things would have passed through many people's hands. And you saw in the example I gave, you know, it kind of says that, you know, you can go back and get your money back. And that was actually something that surprised me about when I came across that in the chapbooks. It probably wouldn't have surprised people who know more about bibliography than me, but I was surprised to see that at such early date, is that kind of sense that these were things that you could take back to the printer or the bookseller, and you could return it, get your money back, and then somebody else could read it. You know, so there's that kind of sense of things being read multiple times. So I do suspect these things were being read by many, many people. If you imagine the metro on the bus, you know, that kind of analogy, you know, people don't take it with them when they leave the bus, they leave it and somebody else reads it. So I think that's a really interesting question. And I'd like to know more about that too. But I do kind of think one of the things we do have to remember is that sales figures would have nothing to do with reading figures.
And we've got a question from David who says, do you know if Scott bought them new or second-hand?
I think Scott was buying them nearly all second-hand. I mean, maybe some of the ones he was buying as a child, they might have been, you know, quite recent, but certainly a lot of them, Scott wouldn't have been the first person to own a lot of these things, I'm pretty sure, because lots of them are printed quite a lot before Scott's life, and even those that are about, the ones that Ainsley was speaking about that relate to the Napoleonic Wars, some of those he may have been buying new, but equally a lot of them you get the sense that they've come into his collection, that he's been buying them in groups, you know, from various places. I mean, I think what is the thing we really are struggling to understand at all are the kind of scrapbook. I don't know scrapbook's quite the right word, but it's the nearest thing I can describe, with things pasted into them, and whether it's Scott who's pasted them in or whether he's bought them as scrapbooks with things already pasted them in. I think Scott has pasted some of that in, rather irritatingly. He's not been a good scholar, not always written where they were from. So we've got an awful lot of work, and the poor people who were cataloguing really did struggle with some of that material because of that. And I suspect that's more, you know, original material that he's, I don't know, I imagine him, I'm probably completely wrong, but I like to imagine him with, you know, a pair of scissors cutting things out and sticking them into scrapbooks. And Lady Scott saying, don't do it on the tablecloth.
Well, we know that Lady Scott, if you remember a few years ago, Lady Charlotte Scott, Scott's wife, her scrapbook sold at Sotheby's. Sadly, Abbotsford was unsuccessful in bringing it back to the collection that day. So there was clearly some scrapbook making going on in the Abbotsford household. It was wonderful to think of them doing it together as a married couple. It's an awesome evening activity.
Yes, thank you. Yeah, the Guelph collection obviously is amazing. So thank you.
Yeah, and I think we've had lots of lovely comments saying, like, thank you very much for the great presentation, really interesting materials. So I'm sure we've got a lot of individuals here who will definitely be keen to look into the exhibition further. I think we are almost out of time, but I did just kind of want to squeeze in my own question. I wondered if with the collection that you've come across anything that's kind of really surprised you, like in relation to like history, like have you kind of learned something new, or has it just kind of added some depth to maybe, you know, like existing knowledge? Like obviously Burke and Hare was mentioned, but has there been anything that was a kind of really unexpected thing that's kind of made you, I don't know, learn something new about the kind of time period?
Ainsley, do you have thoughts on that? Because you know you've worked very intimately with the time period that many of them cover.
Well, what just popped into my mind there, Ali, was when you and I came across the original poll tax bill. Do you remember that moment of looking at it and going, "Oh my goodness, the Poll Tax Act"? Sorry, that was one of those moments that I did not expect to find that crop up in the material. So that was kind of a surprise, I think.
I think there's lots of details about kind of ordinary day-to-day bits of politics and how they're affecting people that I just don't think we get from official history. And they're kind of captured in the chapbooks in lots of ways. So yeah, I think there probably are lots of things in there that would add to our version of history in a more official way as well, about perception, about how particular characters are being perceived at particular moments, sort of in the Jacobite period, or you know, the kind of revolution period, the Napoleonic period, all those times. I think there's bits and pieces of information that really supplement what we know. I mean, I did quite a lot of work on, there's a lot of pamphlets about something called the Pulpish Plot, which features in Scott's novel Pedlars at Peak, and just the amount of detail, and actually how funny some of it was, actually was one of the things. And actually, as everything you encounter with Scott, you realise there's quite a lot of humour in a lot of the material he owns, and there's a lot of humour in Scott. And I think, you know, that sometimes humour that is about people getting on in really difficult situations and just getting on and dealing with their lives when things are pretty bad, which I hope is something, you know, that we can all take lessons from, and, you know, we can all relate to. But I do think it's just that human aspect of history, I think, is the thing that, for me, the chapbooks give us.
Great, thank you. I think that's a really kind of, oh, sorry, Kirsty, I'll let you go.
Throw in a penny from me, which is that one of the things I wasn't expecting to find, and I have to say, had a little bit less hands-on time with the collection than Ali and Ainsley have, although I'm hoping to rectify that now the material's back at Abbotsford. I've absolutely loved the little glimmers of domestic life that we found in the chapbook items. You know, Ali mentioned the getting the spots out of linen, you know, these kind of domestic life hacks in a time before the kind of classic Victorian household manuals, at a time when you wouldn't be expecting to access this information really in any way. And it's there, and it really reflects the fact that, particularly in Scotland, you know, people on the lower rungs of social society were reading. You know, this was a more literate society than pretty much anywhere else, and that they were reading this kind of material and learning from it. You know, it's a little bit like a sort of domestic life magazine or a gossip column sometimes, and I found that aspect of it absolutely fascinating as a woman thinking about the history of women in the past, and, you know, particularly those in domestic jobs. It's just been fascinating. So I can't wait to have more of an explore of that kind of material.
Yeah, I think that's a really valid point. I think especially in history, it can be, when we go further back especially, there's always a kind of missing voice, and kind of working class women is definitely one of those voices that we do not kind of get to hear from. So yeah, I wasn't aware of the chapbooks before. I love like history, and I love learning about different time periods. So I kind of feel this is something I might be spending tomorrow evening looking a little bit further into the collection. But yeah, I think that's a nice kind of note to conclude on. Oh, I think we've got one more. Chapbooks would have been read aloud to those who couldn't read, weren't they? Yeah. And they're obviously nodding and saying yes to that. I'm just we're also getting messages of thank you, and lovely other comments about this event this evening. And I'm just saying, Scott edited Summer's tracks. Are you sorry that he did not edit his own collection of tracks? And that's from David, who obviously done events with before as well.
I don't know. Yes, that's a really good question, actually. Some of these are feeded into Summer's tracks, and you know, like, yeah, I think in a way, I don't think he edited it. I think he drew on it his whole life. I think that, you know, in a way, the chapbooks are everywhere in Scott, and the more I look at them, the more I think that. Maybe I've just been immersed in chapbooks too much for the past couple of years, but, you know, I think he's everywhere. So he doesn't edit them. He just they kind of saturate everything he does, and that's quite nice, I think. So maybe I'm quite glad he didn't edit them, but he used them in different ways.
Great, thank you. And I think as well, just judging by the comments, we will have some new visitors at Abbotsford and people hoping that they can obviously travel back from Canada. So that's really cool to see as well. So I think we'll kind of maybe round things up there. That's at kind of 7:15. So thank you very, very much to Ali, Ainsley and Kirsty. And I think this evening's been very much enjoyed by everyone that's attended. And hopefully it will just be the kind of taster of kind of more Scots, Walter Scott related activities to come. And obviously there's the exhibition that we will include a link to in our email tomorrow, and then we can further explore and investigate and delve into this topic a little bit further. So thank you very much to everyone, and have a lovely evening or afternoon if people have been joining us from elsewhere. So thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks very much. Thank you, everyone.